Can you? Yeah, Debbie, would you mind? No. I just want Debbie's going to pass out the rest of the things up.
My back to the speaker, that would be right.
That right there. So if you're watching later, you can screenshot it. Bam. There you go. That was it. That was all you got. All right. All right, guys, we're going to call this here meeting to order. We're going to start, as we always do, we're going to start with a psalm and reading a prayer. So I'm going to have you actually come on up here. Come on, buddy. Come on up. And you're going to read Psalm 3, right?
Yeah.
All right, go for it. And that's we're going to do this, and then we're going to do a prayer, and then we'll start.
Okay. Lord, how many are my foes? How many rise up against me? Many are saying of me, God will not deliver him. But you, Lord, are a shield around me, my glory, the one who lifts my head high. I call out to the Lord, and he answers me from his holy mountain. I lie down and sleep. I wake again because the Lord sustains me. I will not fear though tens of thousands assail me on every side. Arise, Lord, deliver me, my God. Strike all my enemies on the jaw. Break the teeth of the wicked. From the Lord comes deliverance. May your blessing be on your people.
Amen.
That was for me.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank
Good
you.
work. Oh, come, Holy Spirit, inflame my heart, set it on fire with love. Burn away my self-centeredness so that I can love unselfishly. Breathe your life-giving breath into my soul so that I can live freely and joyously, unrestricted by self-consciousness, and may be ready to go wherever you may send me. Come like a gentle breeze and give me your still peace so that I may be quiet and know the wonder of your presence and help diffuse it in the world. Never let me shut you out. Never let me try to limit you in my capacity. Act freely in me and through me. Never leave me, O Lord, and giver of life. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. All right. So, evening, guys. Good to see you. Okay, so I'm going to stay back here just because that way I'm not wearing this mask, so get a lot of distance from you. We're going to start tonight. We're going to talk about economics tonight and talking about two particular economic systems, socialism and capitalism. But before we do that, there was one question that came up from last week that I'll quickly address. And it was about, Debbie, would you mind just saying it again? Debbie's going to, can you say it or read it?
And it was concerning, what do you call that, warrant?
Concerning the writ of habeas corpus.
Okay, it was concerning that issue.
Yeah.
And the question is, how easy is it to call an action rebellion?
Right.
And, who
gets to decide?
Who gets to decide? I know you said it was the president.
Yeah.
Abraham Lincoln did it, but.
Yeah. Yes. So in the Constitution, if you remember from last week, it says that the writ of habeas corpus shall not be infringed upon except in cases of rebellion. And the writ of habeas corpus, you remember, was your right that the government cannot make you disappear. They have to produce you. If a lawyer goes to the police station and says, I want to talk with Michelle, and you have her in custody, by the Constitution, they have to produce Michelle for you. You can't just disappear. So that right is suspended in cases of rebellion. And like I said last week, Abraham Lincoln suspended that right during the Civil War in order to make some people disappear. And they, I think, largely reappeared at the end of the war, but they did disappear for the duration of the war. So, and the answer is, as far as I know, it's up to the executive office to decide when a case of rebellion has occurred. So that would be the president and his or her advisors. And the reason for that is because largely, it's the purpose of the executive office is to enforce the law. So the legislature passes laws, the judicial system judges the law, and the executive office enforces the law. So it's up to the executive office to determine if an act of rebellion has occurred. Obviously, it's not a very common experience. So now the question of what qualifies as rebellion is arbitrary. It's up to whoever's in office that they would be the ones deciding that. It's the same kind of a thing like in dealing with impeachment. It says that the president can be impeached for high crimes, treason, and high crimes and misdemeanors. What does that mean exactly? It's intentionally vague so that it's up to the legislators to decide if a high crime has been violated. So in every impeachment we've had, whether it was Bill Clinton or Donald Trump or back, I can't remember who the guy was in the 1860s, but or 1870s. But it's up to the legislature to decide whether a high crime has been violated or not. And there's always a debate as to, well, was that a high crime or wasn't it a high crime? Same kind of a thing with habeas corpus. Is it a rebellion or is it not a rebellion? As far as I know, it has only been used to justify Abraham Lincoln's actions during the Civil War. So that's a pretty high bar to set. As far as I know, I think there's something in my mind that's telling me about that the Patriot Act that George W. Bush pushed through by executive order might have been linked to it somehow. But you'd have to research. I'd have to get more research behind that.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right, so let's move on tonight because we got a lot of ground to cover. And this is going to be an interesting one. My objectives for this week, did everybody get, did you get a worksheet? Okay, you got one.
Yeah, they're back
So
there.
my objectives for tonight are pretty simple, I hope. I want us to understand capitalism and socialism better than we do now. So wherever you are right now in your understanding of what capitalism is and what socialism is, I want you to leave tonight with a little bit more information. That's my objective. So if I do my job right, you will have learned something tonight. That is our objective. And then if we get time, second objective is to discover biblical economic values. What are economic values we can actually find in Scripture? We're going to hopefully we'll have time to get to that, but that's a secondary for me.
Yeah, I hope.
Yeah. So I don't plan on talking as much tonight about some things, but economics is not easy to understand. Economic systems like capitalism are one part philosophy, one part civics, one part finances. So they can get very complex, and they can touch a lot of different areas of a society. My main hope is that we walk away tonight with a more complex idea of what these things are than we started with. I think if one fear has kind of cropped up a lot in this current era, it has been a fear around socialism, around what people feel like is the rise of socialism in the United States, and about the idea that this rise is going to lead to irreparable societal harm and irreversible societal harm. And even there's a fear that rising socialism in the United States will lead to greater persecution of the church. A lot of this fear is based on some assumptions about what socialism is and what capitalism is. And what I'm hoping is that, I'm not hoping that everyone leaves here with all their anxieties gone, but I hope to reduce your anxieties a little. It's always a lot easier to be afraid of something we don't understand. And remember, I talked about this 2 weeks ago. If people in power can make you afraid of anything, whether it's capitalism or socialism or war or peace, if they can get you to be afraid, they can control you. They can control the way that you vote. They can control the way that you live. So our objective is to lower our fear. It's not bad to have a reasonable level of fear about certain things, but we also want to raise our understanding, okay? And so what we're going to do is I'm going to describe tonight as easy as I can what socialism is, what capitalism is, and we're going to look at what are the advantages and disadvantages of both of these systems. So prepare to think about these systems positively and negatively, all right? And then we're going to look at examples of how these things operate in our world and in the United States. And finally, if there's time, we're going to get to some of these economic ideas about that we could find in Scripture. You know, what is godly, what is ungodly about these philosophies? Can we find other ideas in Scripture? That kind of a thing. So as we begin, let's remember that these are economic theories, not economic practices. I'm describing tonight economic theories. Theory is always going to be different than practice. So if I say capitalism is this, and you think to yourself, wait a second, I don't recognize that, it's because there is a bit of a disconnect between theory and practice. I'm going to be describing theories. So you might, when I say socialism is this, you might say, wait a second, that doesn't sound like China. Well, that's because China is socialism in practice. And we'll talk about the difference between this. I'm going to talk about principles and theories, okay? Okay. So let's start by discussing capitalism because it's the older of the systems. And there's a lot of economic theories and systems and philosophies. These are the two main ones in our world today and the two ones that are most germane to us. So first one, talk about capitalism. Capitalism developed through the Middle Ages, slowly through the Middle Ages. A lot of scholars have linked it to the development of the banking system, which started in Venice. During the Middle Ages, the decline of the European feudal system. The feudal system was the economic system of the Middle Ages where serfs, peasants basically worked on land that they didn't own, and you had to pay a bunch of your produce to the knight or the lord who owned that land. That's called the feudal system. And feudal systems started to decline, and what they were replaced with was this emerging capital idea. Some people link it to the increase in the use of money as opposed to bartering systems, increase of monetary systems as opposed to monetary bartering systems. Agricultural developments, where people ended up with surplus crops that they didn't have before, and now what do you do with these crops? So all of those things kind of aided slowly to the development of capitalism. It found its footing most soundly in the Enlightenment. Remember, we talked about the Enlightenment when we talked about how the nation was formed and the ideas of this nation came out of the Enlightenment. Capitalism found its footing firmly in the Enlightenment, and especially in 1776, when, of course, everybody knows what was published in 1776, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, right? Everybody remembers that. So in 1776, a man named Adam Smith, who was an economist in England, published a book called The Wealth of Nations. Is the shortened title. I don't remember the long title. But it is basically kind of seen as the literary touchstone of capitalism. It lays out most accurately the theory of capitalism, the philosophy of capitalism. And it had a huge impact on the way the United States was developed. In fact, people like Benjamin Franklin, James Madison quote this book when they're describing the U.S. economic system in their later writings. They quote from Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. So very influential book on our own economic system. Let's see. So Smith argued in his book that markets should determine for themselves how to drive forward economies, and that we should leave markets to decide these things for themselves. And that is called free market capitalism. Free market capitalism. In free market capitalism, the market is free to decide how the economy functions. There's no outside influences. The market itself gets to decide that. Yeah, it's important to remember that there's a lot of different theories and a lot of different capitalist systems. The United States does not have a free market capitalist system, but it's similar to this. So again, I'm talking about theory, not practice, okay? So in this economic theory, and we're going to go to your notes now, and we're going to kind of flesh it out. And I have there a series of questions about how this economic system works. And I'm going to give you the answers here. What happens in capitalism? So in capitalism, the price of goods, the price of a loaf of bread, the price of a car, the price of a house, the price of a building, the price of property is determined by supply and demand. There you go. Wow, I'm even teaching this course. You guys already know all this stuff. Is this rudimentary for you guys, or is this?
No, this
No, that's okay for some of it. Yeah, for the banker and the business manager, this is all. Yeah, okay. But for the rest of you, this may be helpful. Hopefully helpful. Yeah.
It's renewing, reviewing.
So what happens? I'm going to basically look at this. So black pin is demand. Okay, as demand increases over time, you would expect red is price, P for price, the price to also increase. Okay, as demand goes up, your price will go up. So if you came up with a cure for cancer, there's a really high demand for a cure for cancer. A lot of people have cancer, a lot of people willing to pay a lot to cure cancer. So there's a huge demand. So if you had a cure for cancer, you could charge a lot of money for that. Your price point could be quite high and people would still pay for it, okay? But then what happens if your recipe for your cure gets on the internet and people start producing rival cures for cancer that are just as effective as yours? Supply, so blue is supply. Right now, your supply is really low because it's just you producing it. But then somebody else finds out how to produce it. So supply starts going up. And as supply goes up, even though demand is still high, your price goes down. Okay? Because you say up here, you controlled the supply, and you could say, I'm going to charge $50,000 for a dose of cancer cure-all, and people would pay $50,000 for that. Now somebody else is producing it, and they say, well, I'll charge $40,000 for mine. And the price begins to decrease as the supply increases. And all of a sudden you have 12 manufacturers all competing with each other, all making cancer cure-alls that all work. And one guy's doing it for $20,000. So then that guy's going to do it for $10,000. Now you're stuck having to charge only $9,000 for your cancer cure. So the price begins to decrease as supply increases.
But the civil liberties you said should be free.
We'll get to that.
Don't jump ahead.
Don't jump ahead, Michelle. Don't jump ahead. Okay, so that's how price is controlled. Price is controlled by supply and demand. If you have a low demand for something, you can't charge a lot for it because people won't buy it, right? Carl, okay, so number two, the means of production. So let's erase this. The means of production is controlled by, yes, who said that? Thank you. By the manufacturers. And Karl Marx, who we're going to talk more about his theories in a little bit, he called these people the bourgeoisie, which I will spell for you if you would like. The bourgeoisie. Bourgeoisie are the ones who control the means of production. Okay, so let me explain it to you like this. Let's say you have a guy named Joe. Okay, here's Joe. Joe works for the Ford company making F-150s. Okay. This is just bear with me here, okay? So Joe works for Ford making F-150s. Joe does not own the machines that produce these cars, right? He doesn't own the machines. So if Joe decides to quit or Joe gets fired, his days of making F-150s are over because he He doesn't own that. All Joe does is show up to work. He works, right? He puts in to Ford his own time and his own labor. This little hammer. His own time and his own labor. And Ford gives him what?
Paycheck.
Money. Okay?
Middle class.
That's how it works. All right? So Joe, the advantage of the system is Joe doesn't have to think about owning a company and building and machinery. He just shows up to work, he works, he leaves every day, and he gets a paycheck at the end of the day. All right? The advantage is that there's a disadvantage. The disadvantage is, and this is all real numbers, the disadvantage of this reality is that Ford makes $10,000 for every F-150 it produces. Joe makes $200 for every F-150 that he produces. So the advantage is Joe doesn't have to worry about the machinery. The disadvantage is Ford makes a huge amount more, $9,800 more than Joe does for every F-150 that gets made. Okay? That means that Joe gets a very tiny profit, a very tiny return on his time and labor, where Ford pays their CEO $17.4 million a year.
Now, is that their gross profit or net profit?
That is, as far as I could tell in my research, their gross profit. Joe makes, by the way, on average, technician at a Ford factory makes $12 an hour. $12 an hour for Joe, $10,000 for every F-150, and they make one every 52 seconds. Yes.
Yeah, but Joe doesn't have to supply all the materials.
Very correct. Very correct.
Joe doesn't have to pay the taxes. Joe doesn't have to pay payroll. And, you know, and
Yes.
all those costs that we forget to consider into that.
Very correct. Very correct. So we'll get to that. Don't worry, Donna. Don't worry. So there is, like I said, there is an advantage to this for Joe. All Joe has to do is show up and work. He doesn't have to worry about anything else except for that. He can go home with his kids, and he makes money. The disadvantage for Joe is that what he's getting back does not equal what he's putting into it. That's a disadvantage. So there's an advantage and a disadvantage. That's all I said. We're just weighing these things out.
Right.
Okay. Number 3, capitalism. How is wealth distributed? Wealth is distributed through profit. Through profit. You make profit, and the profit generates wealth. In other words, money gets generated this way. So let's say that we add a car dealership. I'll make a little sign here. Here's a car dealership with a bunch of cars on. I'm not going to draw the cars because you know I'm not good at that. But there's a guy here's a salesman. There you go. The salesman at the car dealership pays Ford money. Ford gives him a truck. Okay. That money gets transferred to Ford. Ford uses that money to pay other people and all those other things, and it uses it to pay Joe. So profit is the thing that gets transferred around. Profit is the exchange in a capitalist system. Money goes from here to here to here. Okay, it goes from a dealer to Joe indirectly. All right. And because of this, if it's in pursuit of profit, the pursuit of capital, profit, capitalism, capital, the pursuit of capital becomes the driving force of the economy. If Ford can afford to produce an F-150 that is at the same level of performance but uses 5% less steel in its production, it's going to do that because every penny it can save is a return on their profit. Does that make sense? So it's to their advantage to maximize their profit. That's how capitalism works. You do everything you can to maximize your profit. And when I was talking about that supply and demand thing, they spend a lot of money and time figuring out exactly how, down to the penny, how much money they can charge for a Ford F-150 and you will still buy it. They want to find the sweet spot, because if they charge too much, they won't sell as many and they won't make as much profit. They sell too little. If they charge too little, they'll sell a lot, but per car, they won't make as much money. So there's a lot of calculation, a lot of effort goes into finding exactly how much money they can sell this car to this dealership for to maximize their profit, and exactly how much money they can pay Joe to keep him working there. They don't want to pay him too much. Again, that will cut into their profit, but they don't want to pay him too little because he might leave, and then you got to retrain somebody, and that costs more money. So capital and the pursuit of capital becomes the driving force of a capitalist market, of a market system. Okay. Lastly, wealth is distributed. I hope we finish this up in a couple minutes. Wealth distribution is done via consumers. So now we have Fred, and Fred is the end of the road. Fred pays the dealership money and gets a car. Okay. The dealership pays Ford money and gets a car. Ford pays Joe money and gets time and labor. That's how a market system works.
Did Fred use Joe's employee discount?
Shush. If Fred stops purchasing Fords and buys a Dodge Ram, that's bad for the dealership because he'll start losing money. He won't be able to buy as much from Ford. That's bad for Ford. They'll start losing money. So they won't be able to retain all their employees. And that's bad for Joe because he'll lose his job. So everything relies on Fred paying exactly that much money to this dealership, who can then turn it around and get cars, who can then turn around and get labor and time. Okay? That's how the system works. It's driven by consumers. You all purchasing these things. If you stop purchasing a product, that product will stop being available. Pretty easy stuff, right? Joe uses his money to go buy a house or a hamburger and drives the economy forward in other areas. So let's talk about major advantages of this system. First off, can anybody give me one or two advantages of a capitalist market system? Give me an advantage. The advantages that come to your mind. What might you imagine this would do if we blew this up into a huge economy? What would it do? Yeah.
Anybody has the advantage of making their own money
Right.
and their own wealth.
Yes. People can generate their own wealth. Yeah, absolutely. You could get a job and begin to accumulate capital. Yes. Or you could invest in the stock market, or you can take action. You can start your own business. Yep. And as long as you have a product that people are willing to purchase, you can generate capital. Another thing that this does is it drives innovation, right? And invention.
Yes.
If I can make a better truck that's exactly like an F-150, but it's cheaper, or it's better, or it's more the fuel economy is better, or something like that, I can undersell Ford, cut into their business, make a profit for myself. So it drives forward innovation. I have a reason to want to innovate. I have a reason for invention, right? Another thing that it can do, again, this is all theory, but another thing it can do is it can force a corporation to adjust to the character of their consumers. So if a capitalist society decides that polluting the environment is a bad thing, and there's a shop that makes cars that is really polluting the environment, consumers may prefer a different, even more expensive truck if they have a moral reason to do so, or Prius, and that will force this corporation to change their policies. It could force this corporation to change their policies and become more eco-friendly in order to get back some of that business. So it is possible in a capitalist system, corporations to adjust like that. Here's another advantage I'll give you. By and large, in capitalist countries, or countries that employ capitalism, the quality of life is higher than in socialist-leaning countries. By and large, not in every case, but in general, with some notable exceptions that we'll talk about, in general, quality of life is higher because there's a strong motivation in the market to make goods widely available to people at a low price in order to tap into that sweet spot. Everybody should buy a house. Everybody should be able to buy a house. How many times have you heard politicians say that? That's capitalism at work. And so it drives down interest rates and it drives down construction costs and that kind of thing.
But that has also too, inspires people to want to have that.
Very true. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I think it's a good thing.
It can be a good thing.
I know it is.
It can be a good thing. But if everybody wanted, for example, a gas guzzling Ford 350 and everybody was driving one of those on the road, that wouldn't necessarily be a good thing.
Well, I don't know about that.
Okay, all right, moving on. All right, last advantage I could think of on my own was it is possible in a capitalist system to become very wealthy. It is attainable
Yes.
in a capitalist system to become very wealthy. Like I said, $17.4 million per year is what the CEO of Ford makes. Not to everybody, but it is possible in a capitalist system to become very wealthy.
And that's true.
Yeah.
People don't want to admit it, but it's true.
It's very true.
It's very true. If you've gone to other countries.
Yeah, right. Okay, so because I got a whole nother system to talk about. So let's move on. Can we think of some disadvantages of a system like this? Anybody want to offer perhaps I had 4 advantages and I have 4 disadvantages. Yes. Go ahead.
It is not open to everyone with every spectrum of life. Like if you have a severe disability,
Right.
not at the same.
Good.
option
Yes.
to
Yes.
Go in and be able to be a capitalist and be rich in that environment. Like let's say you have
Yeah.
schizophrenia, for instance, or the early onset of it.
Yes.
You are not having the same advantage as somebody that does not have that because they cannot.
Right.
work
Yes.
in that.
Good. What Kathy's describing is called utilitarianism. Utilitarianism. That means that the utility to which the greater your utility, the greater your ability to make a profit. So, right, if you are physically or mentally disabled, it can limit your ability to get a decent job and whatnot. So the extent to which you have utility, that can cut into your bill. Yes, that is true. That is true.
There are, go ahead, hon. But there are exceptions.
There's always exceptions. This is all just theory. This is all just
There are a
theory.
lot of disability people who have made it big.
Yes. Go ahead, Bonnie.
It separates those who have and those who have not.
Yes, good. So another disadvantage is that there is a wealth gap. And they're like, for example, we talked about Joe versus the CEO of Ford. The CEO at Ford makes a lot of money, whole lot of money, perhaps more money than anyone could even spend. $17.4 million a year. That's a lot of money. In 10 years, that's over that's like $120 million. Whereas Joe is making $23,000 a year. So there's a big difference between those two wages, right? So the wealth gap can be large in capitalist countries. I'll go ahead and name the ones I came up with. It can encourage monopolization and market takeover. So, for example, if you produced seeds for farmers, it is to your economic advantage. If you were such a person who could do this, it is to your economic advantage to engineer those seeds so that they do not reproduce. Because then the farmers would have to come back every year and purchase your seeds instead of naturally growing them themselves. So in capitalism, there is an encouragement to maximize your profit, to do things like that. And in fact, that happens today in the United States. There are seed companies that genetically engineer their seed so that it does not reproduce, that farmers have to continually every year come and purchase seed from them. That is a result of capitalism. Here's another disadvantage. It creates the potential for cultural manipulation through marketing and advertising. It is, let's say, for example, that F-150s become less popular. Ford has to make a decision. Are they going to dramatically change their model, or could they run some really slick, really great advertising that creates a false sense of demand within the population to get their product back on board. And in fact, I know this because I know somebody who worked in the industry. Big companies employ neuroscientists to assist them in creating marketing campaigns and advertisements that trigger areas of your brain to make you desire what you're being shown on a television or a newspaper ad or something like that, to create a false sense of demand and drive their products up. So I'm not going to say it happens in every case, but capitalism can lean towards that sort of thing. Don't worry, we're going to get to disadvantages of every system. There's disadvantages of every, but I'm just telling that there are disadvantages. Okay, let's move on because we got to get going. Let's look at some global examples of this system. Spill water. Here's something that happened globally recently as a result of capitalism. We pushed vaccines at an incredible pace. It usually takes years to develop a vaccine for a disease. We did it in less than a year. And the reason we did it was because the demand for disease control was skyrocketing. Countries, governments willing to pay anything. Name your price, we will pay it. And that sort of incredible demand drives companies to say, we'll put $10 million, $100 million into vaccine development because we know we're going to make a huge profit. We're the first vaccine out of the gate. U.S. government's going to buy 200 million doses of our vaccine. We can have a huge return on our profit. So again, helps drive that innovation, pushes it to the max, right? That's a good thing, actually, I think. In my personal humble opinion, I think that's a good thing. Here's something else that happens globally as a result of capitalism. Dylan, quickly.
The innovation, though, of the vaccines in a capitalist society versus the socialist society, aka China,
Or Russia.
the vaccines from the capitalist society are much better.
They
and
are.
higher,
Much more effective because they are done with a sense of competition. The Chinese government's going to buy all of their own vaccines. Doesn't matter if it's like 20% effective.
Yeah,
The Chinese government's going to buy it.
Right, they don't
So, but the U.S. government has a choice between like 5 different vaccines.
Right.
So they're going to be looking at each one of those vaccines. Which one's the cheapest? Which one's the most effective? Which one's, Okay. Here's something that happens globally that is not such a good thing as a result of capitalism. Outsourcing labor. You got to pay Joe $12 an hour, but you could pay somebody else in China 2 pennies an hour. So who are you going to go with? Right? Capitalism says go with China. That's why everything that you have says made in China, because labor is a lot cheaper. So outsourcing of labor is global. This is largely, national examples of capitalism. This is largely how capitalism works in the United States. It's everywhere, from how much you pay for a washing machine to the price of a coffee. It's all driven by supply and demand. I got to move on quickly because I really want to give you guys time to ask questions. Okay, let's go to socialism. Holy moly. Okay, I can do it. Can I do it?
Yeah.
Come on, I can do it.
You can do it.
Socialism had its touchstone moment in 1848 with the publication of the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And it was largely a result of the reaction of the industrial period. That's when it became really popular. The industrial period was late 19th century. So you're talking about 1850s to 1890s, where the industrialization of Western societies was off the chart. We were making railroads. We created our first factories. We had mass production of clothing and textiles, mass production of what we call white goods, like household goods, manufactured goods. And to make all of these things happen, you had to have huge amounts of population and put everybody to work. So this huge migration happened from people from rural areas to cities during the 19th century to work in the factories. And as a result of that, as a result of free market capitalism and really kind of running rampant, you also had child labor increasing. You had crowded conditions in factories and apartments. You had things like workers being taken advantage of, ghettos, because remember back to Joe, if Ford could pay Joe less money, they would. Well, what if you had 8 people and you only needed one for the job that you're going to do? And this guy, he's not going to work for a penny less than $10 an hour. This guy, though, he'll work for 9. This guy will work for 8. This guy will work for 7. This guy will work for 6. I mean, this guy's thinking to himself, I got to work. I got a family to feed. I have to work. I can't not work. So I'll take $5. And by the time you get down to this guy, he's saying, look, if we don't eat, we're going to starve to death. I mean, if we don't work, we're going to starve to death. So what do you want to pay me? So Ford says, I'll give you $1 an hour. And the guy says, all right, I'll do it. And if the person is 12 years old, maybe they'll work for less. And if the person is never given a day off, and maybe they say, well, hey, I want a day off. And you say, all right, see you later. Because this guy here will work for $1 an hour and he doesn't ask for a day off. And that's what the Industrial Revolution kind of created on its back end. And you get a lot of people like Charles Dickens writing about that as well. So the Industrial Revolution, not such a great time to be a worker in a factory. You make very, very little money. You get overworked a lot. There's no child labor laws. There's nothing about that. So if there was a guy out there willing to work for pennies and he outbid you, that's it. You're out of a job. So socialism came up as a reaction against that. And basically, Marx and Engels argued that capitalism had allowed the bourgeoisie, allowed the owners, the manufacturers to take advantage of the working class. And they called the working class proletariats. Proletariats. The proletariat had been taken advantage of by the bourgeoisie. So they argued what needed to happen was for the proletariats, the workers, the working class, to rise up, unite, and take control of their own economic future. So in this economic system, and we're going to blaze through this, the price of goods is controlled by the government. The government gets to decide how much money is charged for what things. If you make 1 million cancer cures and you want to charge $50,000 per cure, the government can come in and say, you got to charge $50. The advantage is greed doesn't decide who lives and dies. The disadvantage is maybe $50 is too little and it drives you out of business. And then nobody gets a cancer cure. Or maybe you could walk 20 miles and you're in another country where you can charge what you want. And so you take all your cancer cure and you move to somewhere else. And then all the supply's gone with you. So again, there's advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is, just because you're rich, that doesn't mean you get to have the cure and a poor person dies of cancer. The disadvantage is you may leave. Okay. Moving on. The means of production are controlled by the workers. This means that if it's not controlled by the manufacturers, it's controlled by the workers. If Joe doesn't like his wages, he can shut down the plant and say, we're not making another Ford F-150 until you give me $20 an hour. And then the plant operators have to negotiate with the workers in order to get them a wage that they will accept and get them back to work. Okay. Number 3, wealth distribution is done communally. So whether you're talking about a government or another entity or a societal entity or something like that, they get to redistribute the wealth. That means nobody can be too rich and nobody is too poor. Wealth is generated through production and it goes into pots through taxation, and out of those pots, the government or whoever basically levels the playing field. Okay. Number 4, distribution is done via government programs. Distribution of wealth is by government programs. So the government taxes everybody, and then they give them government programs. This is how you redistribute wealth. Universal health care, universal education, universal car insurance, Social Security. Everybody gets a car, right? It's essentially like living in a co-op Each member has the same amount of investment. Each member receives the benefits of the system equally. So everybody gets a car, but it's not a very good car. Right, it's basically what you're looking at.
Here you go.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. Literally exactly right. So let's discuss some of the advantages of a system like this. Can you think of an advantage of a socialist system? And again, we're talking about theory, not about practice. So can you think of an advantage of a socialist system? Yes, right here. Go ahead. Then I'll get to Kim.
The corporation has to appeal to the workers.
The corporation has to what?
To appeal to the workers.
Yes, yeah. So it has the potential to reduce what we might call as worker abuse. Okay.
They're taking care of you.
The government takes care of it.
Taken care of.
Everybody has taken care of. Everybody's taken care of. Yep. Go ahead, Dylan.
If you're not productive, you're still gonna get a paycheck.
Very good. So there's less maybe of a advantage to being productive.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. That's not really technically an advantage because it's kind of sneaky. It's like a backhanded compliment, but I'll allow it.
If you don't have incentive, you're like,
Right,
then
right.
you just go about
Right.
your day and
right.
be a drone and still get paid.
Yes.
That's
Right, it's
advantage.
like, no matter what, you get money. Like it's-
It's a personal appeal.
You
Yes.
don't have to worry about like, oh,
The
my
community
health-
suffers.
Yes.
So that'd be a disadvantage.
That's sort of a disadvantage. Yeah. That's why I said it was kind of backhanded. Okay. All right. I'm going to give you the ones I was thinking of. It lessens the gap between rich and poor. Technically, in a socialist society, you won't have that much of a gap between those who are wealthy and those who are poor. Again, we're talking about theory, okay? Socialist theory.
I was gonna say that's definitely.
We're talking about socialist theory.
Yeah.
Here's another advantage. It can produce a greater sense of community, which is, of course, where we get the word communism.
Unless you're Dylan.
Well, exactly.
For himself.
But you know what? If we were all in the same factory and we were all working as a socialist society here, and we saw Dylan slacking off, we all of us have an investment to go to Dylan and say, Dylan, pick up your game, because it's not just you you're affecting, it's me and it's her and it's my kids and it's her kids.
I'm gonna say revolution.
So
So
it can produce a greater sense of common goal. We're all working together on a common goal. Debbie, did you have? No, you're okay. Thank you for trying to. Yeah. All right. And lastly, actually, you guys hit everything. That's great. Okay, let's talk about disadvantages. Are there any disadvantages to this system that you could see?
Inspires revolution.
How does it inspire revolution? Go ahead.
In practicality, it really does not lessen the gap. It does not lessen the gap.
We're going to talk about practice. I'm just talking about the theory.
Okay.
Disadvantages with the theory of socialism, not the practice, just the theory.
This is a real.
Okay, go ahead, Dylan.
There's a brain drain.
What does that mean?
That means that the talent, those are innovative,
Right.
tend to leave
Yes.
these type of
Yes.
countries because they go where they are.
Where their labor, it could be valued.
Are their values? They're not just.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Brilliant scientists.
Yes.
are-
Yes, exactly right. So I think I had this in here. Yeah, lowers motivation for innovation and that. Yes, it does. It does do that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Takes away the drive for us.
Takes away the drive.
The competition.
Right. Okay, here's some more disadvantages. In general, socialist countries have smaller GDPs than capitalist countries. A GDP is your general domestic or gross domestic product. Yeah. In other words, a socialist system will never be able to generate capital like a capitalist system does.
So their return on investment is not as great.
You can't have as large of an army. You can't have as many parks. You can't have as much, maybe, foreign aid. You can't do as much because you aren't generating the same capital that a capitalist society does. Your GDP is going to be less. Here's another disadvantage. It can produce, and again, not always, but it can produce a sense of reliance on the government, which can then be manipulated by the government. So if you rely on the government for all of your stuff or whatever, and then the government decides that they want to withhold something or they want to make another requirement for you to get you can't just go out and say, all right, well, I'm going to purchase my own health insurance.
Right.
If there's only one health insurance in town and that's owned by the government, it's possible. Now, like I said, it's not always the case, but it is possible for the government to, limit exposure or manipulate that somehow.
Yeah.
Lastly, because of the risk of competition and this real risk of what Dylan said about the brain drain, socialist countries can become more isolationistic and even cut themselves off from the rest of the world, because the fear is we'll lose all of our top-notch people to the better jobs. So we need to close ranks and not allow as many people in or out. And so that's, isolate people from the internet, that kind of. So there's a motivation for that in socialist countries. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's look at some global examples of how this works out to our betterment. When I was talking about workers taking control of the production, you might have been thinking about unions. Unions are the result of socialism. Unions are basic socialist enterprises. So the teachers going on strike, that's a result of socialism. And I would say that's a decent thing. That's a good thing that they can stand up for their own wages and whatnot. Here's something that's not so good globally: human rights violations and purges and that kind of thing. We're going to talk about Russia in a second. And they had some pretty terrible purges. And a lot of it was because of suspicion of people leaving or taking advantage of the system. Thank you, Marty.
I was gonna say Uyghurs, but
Let's look at some national examples. National examples of socialism include, in this country, we have socialism. You realize this, right? It includes the minimum wage, unions, Social Security, universal education, K through 12 universal education, Medicare, Medicaid, welfare, farm subsidies, and any public utilities are all examples of socialism in the United States. Because
Your own money.
if it's that's exactly why it is socialism, because basically the government has an investment that they return to you. So the government gets to decide how much or how little or how often or how few or what age you can begin to take it out, and to whom it goes. So the government gets to decide all those things, and that's why it's socialism. It's not your own investment, unfortunately. Some people would say.
And you're not allowed to not do it.
Exactly right. That's why it's socialism. In free market capitalism, again, the market gets to decide all those things. The market gets to decide how much people are paid. In socialism, the government kind of comes in and pushes their finger on the market and tells it what to do. All right, let's move on. Oh, good. We're getting near the end, and that's good. We have several kinds of socialism in the world today. I want to really quickly introduce you to two of them. One of them is developed in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century, and it's called Marxism-Leninism. Marxism-Leninism. Okay, Lenin was the leader of Russia at the time. And basically, this form of socialism puts a lot of power into the government. And it resulted in a lot of horrendous, terrible, terrible things happening, which we all don't ever want to see repeated. It can sometimes be called a command economy. And this means that the government doesn't just control the market, they can control every aspect of the market. So if they feel like your religion is stopping them from being able to exercise control over the market, they could outlaw it. If they feel like, we already have enough farmers and we want you to be an electrician, then you're an electrician. So it's command economy means the government gets to command you to do whatever they want, basically. Examples of this which occurred today. So the USSR was an example of Marxism-Leninism. It failed. China, Cuba, Vietnam are current examples of a Marxist-Leninist socialism. North Korea, Nicaragua developed out of this system. So they're actually something else, but they both kind of branched off of this form of Marxism and Leninism. The second form of socialism, which is common in the world today, is called democratic socialism. Democratic socialism. And this is when a country decides to take some of the socialist ideas or ideals and insert them into an already established democracy. Examples for this include today Mozambique, as well as some Scandinavian countries, including Sweden and Denmark, other countries like that, that insert socialist ideals into their own democracy. In actuality, in the United States, like I said, we do have some socialist ideas or ideals already present in our system. I listed all those things. There's a lot more of them. And in general, people like those things. The fact that you don't have to decide where you get your electricity from is probably a good thing, because can you imagine if we had free market capitalism in our electrical utilities, and there was 7 companies in town that you could get your electricity from, all competing for your money? What would that look like to our power lines? What would that look like going to you buy a house and you want to switch electrical companies? So somebody comes and redoes all of your, it'd be madness, it'd be crazy. So we have a socialist form of utilities where the government says, nope, you get one choice, and the government gets to decide how much or how little they can charge you, right? Because we only have one choice, they can't just charge us however much they want because they're the only game in town. Government tells them you can't charge more than X amount of money for this electricity. Okay, so we have that, and that's generally a good thing. So there is socialism in the United States already. In terms of our government, and this is where I really want to get to, there's not a lot of socialists in government right now. Democrats are not all socialists. Some of them are. Would you like to know how many? 5 Democrats in the House of Representatives. So that is 5 out of currently 435 members of the House of Representatives are actually democratic socialists, where they're card-carrying democratic socialists. In the Senate, so that's out of 100 people, we have one guy who's actually technically an independent, but has called himself a democratic socialist. You know who this is? Bernie Sanders. Bernie. So we have 5 people in the House of Representatives and 1 person in the Senate, which works out to be around 1 or 1.2% of our legislature that are actually socialists. So the likelihood, to get back to my very first thing about fear, the likelihood that the United States of America would become a socialist nation is pretty small. Now, are there some socialist ideas that we might adopt? That is possible. But remember, we have already adopted several socialist ideas that in general people like, and there's some people who don't like those socialist ideas, but in general, a lot of people do like those socialist ideas. So just to say, if you were worried about socialists taking over, the likelihood of that happening is very, very low. Just to say.
They're very, very vocal.
They are vocal.
Those very sick.
They are vocal. Okay, good. So now we're on to questions. Yes, appropriate time to ask questions. Kim.
Socialism/communism took over Russia, took over China, took over other places.
It is very true.
I mean, it started out small, and where's that now?
That's very true. But I think that we also have to think about the expiration date of those economies. For example, the USSR can generally be described as a failed socialist state. They failed, right? I mean, the whole thing broke apart in the, whatever that was, 1992 or I don't remember what year. Failed miserably. And even in China, China has in the last 10 years experienced an incredible amount of economic growth. Now they're the second largest economy in the world. They're catching up to the United States. Why? Largely because they've stepped away from socialism. They have begun to open up some areas. So they just, it was like 10 years ago that they decided they were going to allow farmers to decide or be engaged in the process of deciding the cost that they were going to sell their produce at. Once they started doing that, those economic powers of the free market took a hold, and the Chinese government, I mean, the Chinese economy is like increased to an incredible amount. So I think we can look at some of those things historically and say, you know, are we at threat of becoming a next USSR? I don't think so, because it's failed so spectacularly. And China, even socialism has failed in China. I think if socialism was to rise in the United States, it would probably look a lot more like Scandinavia than in those other economies, just because those economies seem to have failed largely.
Is it Sweden? They got the capitalism too. They went more. They sort of blended.
That's what democratic socialism really is a blend.
They
Yeah,
blended, because when they were more socialist, it didn't work out. So they
exactly right.
capitalistic parts.
Yeah, exactly right. They pulled back the reins a bit because they realized that it wasn't working as much as they. But you know, it's also a lot easier for those smaller countries to become socialist. You know, it's easy to control an economy when your economy is in the you know, millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, as opposed to the U.S. economy in the trillions of dollars. It's just more manageable to control a population of 5 million people as opposed to 300 million people. So socialism, again, I don't know if it could work at the same scale. Karl Marx thought that the proper way to bring about socialism is to have a violent revolution, where you threw off the bourgeois and asserted and redistributed all the land. Well, that's exactly what Russia did. And it failed spectacularly. So at least in that respect, Karl Marx was dead wrong. And I'm not too concerned about that happening here because we've learned from their lesson, I hope. Go ahead, Joe.
So like with the fail of the rise of the
Proletariat.
yeah, I never pronounced it.
That's all right.
That's where you split off from like the economic system to cultural Marxism, because
Yes.
correct me if I'm wrong, but that's when he gets into the ideals of like, oh, it's not economic reasons, there's cultural factors that made the uprising fail.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
That if that's where the split happens, what's the danger factor
Right.
in cultural Marxism versus
Yeah.
the economic system?
Good question.
How
Yeah.
do I talk about that?
No, I agree. And I think that, so this goes back to why I wanted to start with the Declaration of Independence as a precursor. Because if you remember back then, I talked about some of the unique fundamentals of the American experiment. And one of those fundamentals is individual liberty.
Yeah.
And individual liberty doesn't jive well with socialism.
Yeah.
Because again, Dylan needs to be concerned about all of us, not just himself, right? But if Dylan starts being more concerned, come on, Dylan. If Dylan becomes more concerned about his individual liberty and less concerned about all of our corporate and communal responsibility, then socialism will fail. And this is another reason why I think it would be very difficult for us to become culturally Marxist or communist or socialist because it's very, very, very difficult to change the culture DNA like that.